We are so lucky to we are so lucky today to have Dr. Mike Pullman with us. Mike is a senior program officer in the Implementation Science and Systems Comparative Effectiveness Research Program at PCORI. Before joining PCORI, he was a research professor at the University of Washington School of Medicine. He has expertise in implementation science, multi-systems collaborative service delivery for behavioral health, research methodology and analysis, and issues around clustering, randomized trial design, longitudinal analysis, and many other methods. He's also the host of the Implementation Science podcast. We're so lucky that he's going to be here today. I have to tell you, I got to know Mike when I was applying, putting in a letter of intent to PCORI, and I had no idea that they had A, experts in implementation science, B, a million resources in implementation science. I was completely in the dark, and I saw the light because I got to meet Mike. So we thought it would be great for everybody to come and understand the really terrific work that PCORI is doing in this space and the opportunities for funding. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to him and let him take us through. And we will have time for questions at the end. So put them in chat or just write them down so that we can get to them when we're done with the presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Karen. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Karen mentioned, we had a really nice opportunity to work together in the past, and I love sharing the gospel of PCORI and the work that we're doing in implementation science and inviting your applications for further funding to help both bridge the gap in the innovation to implementation world, and also to help perhaps bridge the funding gap right now. We recognize that things are it's an unprecedented time out there, and so we invite your applications and your interest. As Karen said, my name is Mike Pullman. I'm a senior program officer. My specialty is implementation science at PCORI. I'm the only implementation science senior program officer, and my job there over the last year and a half has been to help bolster our ability to receive and evaluate studies that are focused on effectiveness implementation hybrid designs, and to really help all the program officers get better at reviewing these studies for their responsiveness, and also to communicate with the public and you all, scientists, around the efforts that PCORI has been involved in. It may be a surprise to you that about half of our studies in comparative effectiveness research are hybrid designs. Most of them are hybrid type 1s, but about half of them are hybrid designs. So PCORI does fund work in implementation science. We also fund methods work in implementation science, and we fund direct implementation efforts. So we're going to go through all of that today. I want to tell you, I love working at PCORI, and I love it because it has excellent values, because of the work that we do. You know, our motto is research done differently, and with that's really true. The work, as you'll see today, and I hope to convey to you today, the work that PCORI does is really aimed at maybe filling in some of the gaps that traditionally exist in funding, in terms of taking research into the field. And I also love my colleagues. We have about 34 wonderful program officers across all of our programs. These 34 program officers are insightful and kind and helpful. And then we have one really, really mean program officer. So hopefully you don't get that one, and you find one of the good ones. The probability is good for you. So let's get started and talk about some of the funding that PCORI is. Talk about a little bit of background of PCORI and what it is that we're focused on, and then I'll talk with you about some of our funding opportunities. So PCORI is the leading funder of patient-centered comparative clinical effectiveness research, and that's really key. And this is one of the key mistakes that people make when they apply to PCORI. They don't fully understand what clinical effectiveness research is. So we're going to talk about that in detail, and we're especially going to talk about clinical effectiveness research in under a paradigm of hybrid effectiveness designs. We're an independent nonprofit research institute. We were started by the federal government under bipartisan legislation. However, we're not a federal agency. And we fund research that is specifically designed to help people make better informed decisions. So several things set PCORI apart. As I mentioned, we're focused on this comparative clinical effectiveness research. And we're really looking for finding some of these studies to help patients and other stakeholders make really well-informed decisions about either what services to implement or what services to choose if you're a patient. In addition to research, as I kind of alluded to earlier, PCORI also funds research-related activities like dissemination of the work that we're doing and the research findings that have happened from PCORI-funded studies, and also the actual direct implementation of that work. And I think that makes PCORI somewhat unique as a research funder. And then also one of the other things that makes PCORI unique, and we'll talk about in more detail, is that we strongly emphasize patient and stakeholder engagement across all stages of the research process and centering the patient's preferences and interests at the heart of the research that we fund. So let's talk a little bit about dissemination and implementation sort of broadly. So you all are really familiar with this, I'm sure, but when we say dissemination, we mean increasing the awareness of findings among relevant audiences. And PCORI does this in a number of ways. I'll show you one in the next slide. And then we also fund work around implementation, which is the more active process of actually promoting the sustainable uptake of evidence in research setting or in practice settings, excuse me. And through all of this, PCORI strongly emphasizes and funds and provides resources online for ways to engage stakeholders, patients, funders, providers, etc., to help build stakeholder interest and build stakeholder capabilities to sort of create these pathways to this broader adoption of these research findings. Some dissemination materials that you might find useful on our website. This is just one among many. We provide these PCORI evidence updates where we distill findings from PCORI funded studies or systematic reviews that we've done. I think we have about 13 to 14 of those evidence updates at our website. You can see the website link down at the bottom. And really, in the interest of getting evidence updates to the right audiences, PCORI will work with stakeholders to really figure out how to convey the why research findings are important to audiences, present those findings in non-technical language, and we try to reach end users through our website, through newsletters, blog features, and then through all of our dissemination efforts, we really try to co-brand those efforts to ensure trust and really show the broad array of kind of institutional and other stakeholders that are involved in those dissemination efforts and in the research efforts. So, all right, so that's some of the background. Now I'm going to get into the probably more exciting stuff for you. We're going to talk about some PCORI funding opportunities related to dissemination implementation and implementation science. And I'm going to start with let's start with a broad overview. So as I mentioned earlier, the heart of what PCORI is focused on are these comparative effectiveness research awards, where we're funding studies that compare two or more active treatments, services, or health practices to see which works better. We also fund these dissemination and implementation awards to deliver the evidence. We fund engagement awards that are really focused on building a foundation of patients, stakeholders, caregivers, clinicians, and other communities into that health research process. And we fund methods studies, which are focused specifically on developing and testing methods, specifically around improving comparative effectiveness research. We're going to focus first today on probably things that actually might be a little bit less interest to you, so that we can then get more in depth on the CER awards. So I'm first going to talk a little bit about our dissemination implementation portfolio and some of the engagement awards, just a little bit, and our methods awards, and then we're going to talk in most depth about the CER awards, focusing most exclusively on hybrid implementation studies. But just so you can sort of see, I think that PCORI, while some funders really oftentimes provide an array of funding that's focused on developing specific investigators and helping them develop as in their career, PCORI is almost more interested in interventions or programs and taking those programs from after the efficacy studies have been done, really doing these comparative effectiveness research studies to identify what works best, funding some hybrid studies to determine the best ways to implement those in real world settings, and then we fund these D&I projects to demonstrate that these approaches to implement the results to the CER studies can be used in real world settings to actually impact hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of patients nationwide. And we're also engaged in these HSII projects, which are working very closely with large systems to help develop their capabilities at implementing a broad array of effective research from PCORI. So if you go to our website and you do a search for PCORI funding opportunities, you're going to see a large number of these opportunities. Some of these aren't open right now. You'll see on these slides as I go through there, some of them as like this dissemination award for the limited competition. It says, to be decided for an open date. So there's not actually an open date for that, but there is an open date for this engagement dissemination award. So here's two of the awards that we fund in the area of dissemination. The engagement award opportunity helps organizations and communities share relevant research findings from specifically PCORI funded comparative effectiveness research. So if any of you are working with community organizations and you want to focus on the dissemination of specific findings from a PCORI research award, that's a funding opportunity that you might explore. It's up to $300,000, and I think those awards are for 2 years. I can't remember for sure. And then the dissemination award, again, this one's not open right now, but it provides up to $300,000 for similar work. However, it's limited specifically to PCORI funded awardees. So you'd have to have already received a PCORI award in order to apply for it, and that'd be something you'd want to talk to your program officer about. Our funding opportunities in dissemination, there's four major ones that are probably of most interest to you. The first one is, oops, sorry. First one is implementation planning and other implementation awards. And they're designed to support PCORI funded research awardees. So these are limited competition. Again, you would have already had to have received funding from PCORI to receive one of these awards. So these are after somebody has completed a PCORI funded research award, then we can provide some funding up to $1.8 million for the limited competition implementation awards and up to $200,000 for the planning awards in order to implement PCORI funded comparative effectiveness research into clinical practice. And then the open competition, however, draws on the expertise and creativity of a broad applicant pool to promote the uptake of specific PCORI funded CER. So each cycle that these come out, the funding opportunity describes the evidence eligible to be the focus of awards. In other words, you can't decide which PCORI research that you would like to implement within your setting. It's going to be something you would have to choose from that would be within the PCORI funding announcement. And usually I think we have, probably 3 or 4 different areas of research that are open for this implementation. The funding for that and the open dates are to be decided. This isn't open right now, but those come out, a couple of times a year, if I recall correctly. And then finally, we have this. Oh wait, so yeah, those implementation awards are probably going to be the most interest to you. We also have this health system implementation initiative, and I just want to talk about this briefly, even though I think this is kind of a challenging. These are really large words, but they're just I'm so excited about this program. I think it's so excellent what PCORI is doing here. So far, we've funded 42 health systems in 41 states and Washington, D.C. And interestingly, Massachusetts is not one of the states that have been funded yet. So you might want to get on that. And what we do is we provide up to $50 million and 5 years of funding commitment from PCORI to help systems ramp up efforts to move findings from PCORI funded research into practice. So we're currently representing about 800 hospitals serving 79 million unique patients, which is almost a quarter of the United States population across these 41 states and Washington, D.C. These include academic medical centers, community-based health systems, integrated care, healthcare delivery and finance systems, the Veterans Health Administration, et cetera. And in addition to announcing these participants, PCORI actually currently has an open announcement for an HSII funding opportunity. So if you're interested in that, please check that out. All right, so those are the funding opportunities that I think might be of maybe less interest to this group from what I've heard. Again, I just wanted to talk about those briefly. Here are our research opportunities. And at the heart of all of our research opportunities, as I mentioned, is comparative effectiveness research. So let's talk about the three areas where if you were interested in doing some research using a hybrid effectiveness implementation study or approach, you could apply to one of these three areas. So the Broad Pragmatic Studies, or BPS, is an opportunity that seeks to fund patient-centered CER. And we have these three award sizes, up to 5 million, 5 to 12 million, and up to 12 million, each with slightly different requirements and limitations. We have topic-focused opportunities. So currently in the cycle, we are reviewing LOIs around cancer and around retrospective observational designs. And those topic-focused opportunities change with each cycle. But just because something is a topic-focused opportunity doesn't mean you can't apply for it in the regular broad pragmatic studies. So for instance, as I just said, cancer is something we're reviewing for right now, but if you have a cancer-related study that you want to do, you can still apply for that within the broad pragmatic studies. Really, these topic-focused opportunities are just a way of PCORI signaling to the public what topics we're really interested in receiving studies on. And then when we do our reviews, we can pull together a group of experts in that topic area so we can provide a more thorough and knowledgeable review. And then finally, our largest awards are these phased large awards for comparative effectiveness research. These support large scale, high impact randomized trials in comparative effectiveness research. And there's usually some risk involved in the trial. And I don't mean risk in terms of, harm to patients, although that could be true, but really it's risk in terms of failure of the trial. So these placer awards have a feasibility phase, usually to do a pilot trial and make sure that recruitment is feasible, et cetera, and the study processes are feasible. And then after that feasibility trial, before PCORI will sort of do a review, and if everything looks feasible, then we provide continued funding up to $22 million to conduct the trial. So those are the research opportunities of probably of most interest to the group here. We also have methods fundings, and we also provide methods funding and methods awards. And our portfolio of methodological research supports this work to improve the design and conduct of comparative effectiveness research. And that could include doing some methods work around implementation science related topics. And in fact, there are some things that are highlighted right now that I think of a real interest to implementation science. We're finding awards related to methodology regarding smart trials, for instance, and other related topics. So as I mentioned earlier, I encourage you to visit our website, review those detailed announcements, and if you haven't done so already, sign up for our emails so you can stay in touch with us around additional research announcements as they come out. All right. So as I said earlier, probably the biggest challenge that we receive in our CER related applications and letters of intent that we get is that people aren't actually submitting CER studies. So what is comparative effectiveness research? So comparative effectiveness research compares two or more medical treatments, services, health practices, or even implementation strategies. So as I mentioned earlier, we do fund hybrid type 3 studies that would be comparing implementation strategies. We're looking for research that's providing patients and clinicians and other healthcare decision makers with information to make better informed decisions and that actually have a really good chance for uptake in those worlds. So we're really looking for what we call like a decisional dilemma that's truly applicable across these stakeholders. We're focusing on outcomes that are meaningful to patients and outcomes and looking at studies that are likely to improve clinical practice. Here's a nice flow chart that you can use to determine whether or not your study idea is a good fit for PCORI. So first of all, are you proposing research to compare two or more healthcare treatment services or care delivery strategies? You can compare a strategy or a treatment against usual care. However, if you are doing that, you really need a strong justification for usual care. PCORI is really looking for CER research that's comparing two active treatment approaches or real decisional dilemma. In other words, situations where the usual care is insufficient and patients or providers want to know of two alternatives, which would be the best. And so I would say sometimes one of the mistakes that people make a lot is they're really applying for research that's either efficacy or just kind of plain old effectiveness research, where they're looking at some sort of active treatment approach and comparing it against usual care. And we oftentimes throw out letters of intent or deny them rather because they don't meet that standard. We also want the treatments that you're looking at in this comparative effectiveness research to have good evidence of efficacy or to have good evidence of widespread use. And when we say widespread use, we just mean that the approach or the intervention is being used in more than one healthcare setting or system, rather. We want research that addresses a decisional dilemma, a true decisional dilemma that I mentioned earlier that can inform health or healthcare decision making. CER is also research that's in the PCORI world is engaging patients and other partners in the research question and using selected patient-centered outcomes. And PCORI has no interest in conducting research that will just sit on a shelf somewhere. So we're looking for research and study results that are going to provide evidence that can be readily adapted in real-world settings. And if all those apply, then yes, your study might be a good fit for one of PCORI's CER opportunities. And this decision tree is available on our website, and I can make my slides available after the presentation as well. I thought some of you might be interested in this. This is something that a lot of people don't know about. We do also provide mentorship opportunities within CER awards. So our mentorship opportunities and our mentorship funding is not standalone funding. It has to be put into your application for a regular CER award, and we can provide salary support up to 25% efforts for mentees and 5% mentors for earlier mid-career investigators or for careers investigators who are interested in making a transition to conducting patient-centered comparative effectiveness research. Or, and this is really unique and pretty special, we provide mentorship funding for patient and community partners or patient and community partner mentees. As I mentioned earlier, I just mentioned the mentorship applications are not standalone, and you can look at our funding announcements for more details. PCORI expects strong engagement with stakeholders and in particular patients, and we have foundational expectations for those engagement. There's 6 foundational expectations. They're displayed here. We have all kinds of online guidance and FAQs and videos and PDFs on our website. There's some clickable links here. But the 6 foundational expectations is that there's true representative involvement across a wide range of stakeholders, that those stakeholders are involved early, and that it's ongoing. That there are actual dedicated funds in your budget for these engagement efforts, and you're providing true partner compensation. So you're respecting the partner, all partners' input, and you're showing that respect through this compensation. We expect you to engage in efforts to build a capacity to work as a team. As I mentioned, we have lots of resources online to help with that. And then to review and assess that inclusion and your capacity to work as a team on an ongoing basis. Finally, one last aspect, I think. Yes, one last aspect about how we do research differently. And that was we also have a large focus on you collecting data, researchers collecting data around patient-centered burdens and economic outcomes. There's a very, very common misunderstanding that PCORI does not want you to collect data on costs, and that's not at all true. But what is sort of true, and that the reason that people think we don't want you to collect data on costs is that PCORI actually does not allow you to conduct cost effectiveness analysis within our while using research dollars from PCORI. And this just comes from a legal interpretation of our authorizing legislation and what's in there. So you can collect data on costs. We encourage it. We encourage you to collect data, obviously, on effectiveness. So you can report on costs, you can report on effectiveness. Just don't divide one by the other when you report it. So don't do that cost effectiveness analysis. And we also want other kinds of costs to be captured as well in terms of patient-centered burdens and economic outcomes. So some examples here are maybe lost wages for caregivers or patients, transportation expenses, childcare costs that are an aspect that's important to consider when we're considering whether or not to implement certain interventions. We have a landscape report online actually a really interesting read and some technical support documents that provide some research guidance on how to identify these patient-centered burdens and economic outcomes. All right, how long do we? Okay, or it's 25 minutes after the hour. Great. So now let's, I think, spend most of the rest of the time just talking about hybrid effectiveness implementation studies within comparative effectiveness research. So as you all probably know, hybrid studies are really nice because they speed the movement of research findings into routine practice because you'll be collecting data both on the effectiveness of an intervention while also collecting data on implementation strategies or barriers and supports to implementation. And as I mentioned earlier, PCORI has funded a lot of hybrid studies. It's almost half of our portfolio. Between 20 to 2024, we funded more than 50 hybrid effectiveness implementation CER studies. And then actually there's a lot of studies that probably are hybrids as well. These were 50 sort of self-described hybrid studies, but there are a lot of other studies that are collecting, that are sort of kind of like hybrid ones. They're collecting data on barriers and supports of implementation. So PCORI is very interested in this. And it's a common misunderstanding that we don't fund hybrid research. One of the things we've created over the last year and a half is a really helpful frequently asked questions document. I'm going to go through at a high level the most important aspects of that FAQ, but I encourage you, if you're going to be applying for funding and using a hybrid effectiveness study, then please spend some time on that FAQ. This is probably a review for you, but we're dividing at PCORI. We're using the kind of the typology that's in the field, type 1, 2, and 3 studies. And so type 1 studies are appropriate for PCORI when there's limited knowledge in the field about what helps or hinders an intervention success. And that the decisional dilemma is really trying to decide, which is the most effective intervention while also collecting some data around barriers, supports, and the best ways to help implement an intervention. So you may not actually have an implementation strategy developed fully in a type 1. You may be using kind of artificial implementation strategies. The research team may be, getting involved in implementation in a little bit stronger of a way than they would in a type 2 or a type 3 study. But the ultimate goal of a type 1 study is really to test that effectiveness of interventions, but to also come out of the study with some really strong knowledge about what would help implementation in the real world. In a type 2 study, what would make a type 2 study appropriate for CER? That's where at least one of the proposed comparators or treatments is not being used as much or as well as it could be in the real world, or when the best implementation strategy is unclear and there's a decisional dilemma really related to the comparative effectiveness of the intervention. Type 2 studies get pretty complex at PCORI because, again, we're doing comparative effectiveness research, and there are some type 2 studies, like type 2As, people call them, where we're only comparing 2 interventions and 1 implementation strategy, and that gets weird in a CER framework. We're working on some additional guidance around type 2As. Type 2Bs are situations where you would be comparing both 2 or more interventions and 2 or more implementation strategies, and those can be a little bit clearer inside a CER framework. And then a type 3 study is focused on implementation strategies and comparing 2 implementation strategies. And so we're really looking for situations where the clinical intervention is proven to be effective, but it's underused, and the decisional dilemma is really related to how to best increase the use of the intervention. Our FAQ has this huge table here, along with all kinds of write-up. I'm going to break this table down for you. So in a type 1 study, we're looking for primary aims, as I just mentioned, where we're testing the impact of clinical interventions on patient-centered clinical outcomes. Type 2 is simultaneously testing interventions and implementation strategies. And type 3 studies, we'd be looking at a primary aim of testing the impact of implementation strategies on implementation outcomes. The important thing here that I want you to notice this, so those primary aims are very consistent with what you would expect from these types. The important thing here is that we also expect secondary aims. So in a type 1 study, there has to be an implementation aim as a secondary aim, and usually those are to evaluate implementation factors, not necessarily to collect implementation outcomes. So there's kind of a causal aspect there. So really the evaluation of the implementation factors, we're really thinking about in type 1 studies, the implementation that your data that that you collect, the implementation data that you're collecting is more like a moderator than an outcome. But there can be some situations where an outcome would suffice as well. The secondary aim in type 3 studies, you are required to have at least one secondary aim that's focused on patient-centered clinical effectiveness. Even if your intervention has strong evidence of effectiveness on clinical effectiveness in other studies, we still need you to collect that data in a PCORI-funded CER type 3 study. Yeah, so populations are patients in a type 1 study, the primary population, providers in a type 3 study, and patients and providers in a type 2 study. Your interventions are largely going to be clinical interventions in a type 1 study with a comparator that's some alternative clinical intervention, or as I mentioned, treatment as usual with justification. Your interventions in a type 2 study are going to be both interventions and either one implementation strategy or two implementation strategies. And your intervention in a type 3 study are going to be just comparing, you're going to be comparing two or more implementation strategies to some alternative implementation strategy and or implementation as usual. So here's some requirements that are really important to keep in mind around outcomes. So in a type 1 study, we expect the primary outcome to be a patient-centered comparative clinical effectiveness outcome and for that to be powered. And that's actually true across all of our studies. So that's no different than just standard CER research, non-hybrid CER research. Now your outcomes, now you might have implementation outcomes as I mentioned earlier, but that's not required, but you must include implementation variables. So maybe you're looking at implementation as a moderator type of a variable. In a type 2 study, we expect you to have both patient-centered comparative clinical effectiveness outcomes and implementation outcomes, and those must both be statistically powered. In a type 3, your primary outcome has to be an implementation outcome. It must be statistically powered. And then you do have to have a patient-centered comparative clinical effectiveness outcome, as I mentioned, but we just recommend that it be powered. Sometimes that can be challenging, we recognize, in implementation studies, so it's not required. Finally, this is the thing that I think trips the most people up. So I left this for last so we can kind of focus on it the most. Is we do have different evidence expectations when you submit your LOI or your letter of intent or your proposal. In a type 1 study, as with any CER study, your intervention has to have some evidence of efficacy or to be demonstrated to be in widespread use. And in a type 1 study, you actually don't have any requirements around the implementation strategies or even that you really fully define your implementation strategy. In a type 2 study, same thing. The intervention has to have some evidence of efficacy or be demonstrated to be in widespread use. But in a type 2 study, we do expect you to define and describe your implementation strategy or strategies. We recognize that the research on implementation strategies is still pretty nascent. And so because of that, we don't have the we don't have the high level of evidence for efficacy that we would have for an intervention. Okay? We just are asking you to provide some underlying evidence that the implementation strategy has efficacy or is in use in clinical settings. But again, that evidence may be inconsistent or lack clarity. Really, the most important thing is that you establish that there's some underlying evidence and then that you describe the implementation strategy in enough detail for us to understand. It's not sufficient to just say you're going to be using, audit and feedback, but you just describe how you're going to be using audit and feedback, the components that will be within it, so that we can really judge whether or not the evidence of efficacy is applicable in that setting. And that's true also for type 3 studies. Now, the main difference for type 3 studies is that, again, because the focus is on implementation strategies in type 3 studies, and because the rationale for type 3 studies is that we're using a type 3 study when interventions are well established, we expect actually a higher level of evidence for the interventions. We expect those interventions to be very well established, and that you also need to provide some, and you can do that through citing, a systematic review or a meta-analysis. And then we also expect you to provide some evidence that there's limited uptake, that despite the fact that the interventions work, that it's not being used as much or as well as it could be in a real world setting. So people on for these type 3 studies and type 2 studies around implementation strategies, people oftentimes really struggle when providing underlying evidence of efficacy and describing those implementation strategies. I've seen a lot of LOIs and proposals either get denied or declined for funding because of that. So I encourage you to look at our landscape review. It's a little bit old at this point. It came out in 2023, but PCORI funded a landscape review of evidence for over 500 implementation strategies and provide the 5 strategies that have the strongest evidence of effectiveness. So this is a really nice resource for you to turn to in terms of trying to find what works in terms of implementation strategies. And you can also cite this landscape review, although I would cite more than just this landscape review, but you can also cite this landscape review as one piece of evidence for why your implementation strategy has evidence for efficacy. All right. So we have 6 for all of our broad pragmatic studies, and yes, all of our broad pragmatic studies, and really any of the CER funded research. Okay, I guess I don't have a very good transition here. All right, I'm gonna stop. Stopping. I'm not talking about hybrid effectiveness implementation studies anymore. Just gonna talk about some. These are kind of tricks and tips for getting funded. Right. So the main thing that you need to do in terms of getting funded is look at our review criteria. And at the very back of every PFA, every PCORI funding announcement, we have criteria. Those criteria might change a little bit from, for topicals or for placer as those come out. But these are the ones for broad pragmatic studies. These very rarely change very much from cycle to cycle. And these are the things that you need to focus on the most because literally the merit reviewers sit down and they score you on each one of these merit review criteria. And using the exact same questions that are given to you in those PFAs. So ask yourself those questions as you're writing your proposal. So first of all, we're looking for research that is filling a critical evidence gap. So you're going to need to provide us with uh, strong justification that there's some gap out there that needs to be solved. Now, if you're doing a hybrid effectiveness study like a type 2 or a type 3, that critical evidence gap should probably focus on the fact that it should probably focus on not so much the efficacy for the intervention, but the fact that the intervention is not being used as much or as well as it should be, and giving us evidence that that's the case. We're also looking for you to provide us with evidence that there's a high likelihood that your research results will be adopted into clinical practice. We want you to have stakeholders and program partners that are, funders or that are clinical service providers, et cetera, that express their support for this research and their likelihood of using it. And that's one way to do that. Also, you can go to, national organizations, et cetera. And you can also always, as always, make a logical argument for why your research is of merit and likely to have some uptake. The scientific merit, we're going to look at everything, how you're conducting your research, power analyses, whether or not your sample is likely to, be recruited. You provide good evidence for that, all kind of the standard stuff around scientific merit. Looking at the investigator and their environment, how strong it is there, your past research awards, and what success you've had. And then we have the last 2 that are really focused heavily on patients. So, what's your level of patient-centeredness of the study? Have you proven to us that the outcomes that you've chosen are truly patient-centered and are of interest to patients? And what's your engagement plan? What's your past level of engagement with your partners? And what's the plan for the future? Are you meeting with them regularly? Are you meeting all of those foundational expectations that I referred to earlier? The primary reason for the denial of like the initial letter of intent proposals in CER studies, as I mentioned earlier, is people proposing research that aren't CER. So use our flow chart, make sure that it's CER, make sure you make an argument across all those areas. The second primary reason is that it lacks LOIs oftentimes lack patient-centeredness and patient engagement. Oftentimes we also receive studies in which the decisional dilemma is unclear. Sometimes it's like, well, we receive research that seems like perfectly good research. We just can't tell why people are proposing to compare those 2 things. And sometimes it's just like, well, that's just, the 2 principal investigators have studied those things in the past, so they want to compare them head to head. That's not a compelling decisional dilemma or a reason to fund comparative effectiveness research. You need to really make it clear that there's a true dilemma there that we're trying to answer with that research. Sometimes in LOIs or in proposals, there's just insufficient evidence or unclear rationale for the comparators, kind of is aligned with that decisional dilemma. Those go hand in hand. Lacking evidence for real world uptake. And then if you're applying not to CER, but applying to one of those dissemination and implementation program projects I referred to earlier, a common mistake is proposing original research rather than proposing real world implementation of PCORI findings into practice. And actually, that the inverse happens as well. Sometimes in the CER studies, we will receive research that really seems more like implementation research or implementation work rather than research, and vice versa. So make sure those are aligned. The biggest tip I can give you is to contact us early and often. The best thing you can do is to get onto our website. We have a little button up there that has the help desk, and to click on that button if you have questions. Even if you have even if you're doing an implementation study, don't contact me directly. That they will make sure that your question is aligned with the best program officer. We're very responsive. You should receive a request within a few days, and they'll connect you to a program officer if they can't answer your question directly. If it is implementation science, like if you have a question around a hybrid study, they'll probably connect you with me. But that's the best way to get a hold of us. We like to track those and how they've been answered over time, and that's our process for doing that. The second funding tip and recommendation is to authentically engage patients, as I mentioned earlier, in developing your proposal. Our website has dozens of resources to assist you. Please spend some time on there. And there's even some resources for patients and stakeholders to help them understand what research is and be more informed as you work together in your engaged process. For CER program opportunities, I know I keep hammering this home, but really ensuring that the decisional dilemma is a pragmatic question of importance to patients and other stakeholders, and then showing evidence to us of that. That decisional dilemma, once answered, will lead to real-world uptake. And for D&I program opportunities, ensuring that your project aims to put PCORI-funded evidence into practice. It's not just any research that we want to fund into practice. It's really PCORI funded evidence. A few other things. So there may be some ways that you want to get involved or stay connected. As I mentioned, PCORI is an incredible organization. I'm so happy there, and we want involvement from all of you. And this can be really also excellent for your own professional development. We have 4 advisory panels, and you can apply to serve on one of those advisory panels. We're always looking for merit reviewers. I've served as a merit reviewer. I guess I didn't lead with this, but I did soft money research at University of Washington. I was a professor there for 20 years. So I've kind of been in this world for quite a while. And I was a reviewer for a variety of federal agencies. And for me personally, especially when I was a junior faculty member, being a merit reviewer was the #1 way for me to learn how to write a really good proposal. It's just so valuable. It does take a lot of time. I'm not going to lie about that. But it's also pretty fun to work with us, and it can be so useful for you and your own professional development and your own ability to write really, really high quality proposals. So I encourage you to do that. You can also look at our website about becoming a PCORI ambassador or a peer reviewer. Every one of our projects, we require that they write a final report that is digestible by a wide variety of audiences. And we have peer reviewers come in and actually review those reports and make sure that everything is up to snuff. And we fund projects to do this. And again, this is done just so that we can ensure that PCORI funded research is widely disseminated in a way that people can understand. And being a peer reviewer can also, as I mentioned, around being a merit reviewer, being a peer reviewer can also really help improve your own ability to write grant proposals and to think about how to conduct high quality science. We have all kinds of PCORI events that you're invited to. If you get on our listserv, you will be notified of those. And then we're always looking for new ideas around patient-centered research and topic themes, and so you can suggest those to us as well. As I just mentioned, we have a weekly email newsletter, and that has all kinds of alerts around these funding opportunities, results from our research, these events I just mentioned. So please feel free to get on and subscribe. And we also have, we're also on, all the socials. If that's something you do, go ahead and find us there. Here's some contact information. As I mentioned earlier, the best way to contact us is to get, if you have an idea around a specific grant proposal idea, submit a help desk request at our website. But if you have just general questions about implementation science, you just want to talk to me about implementation science, I love that. Please feel free to reach out to me directly around that. Thank you. I think now we will take some questions.
Yeah, fantastic. That was just a tour de force. Thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. We've got several questions in the chat, so I'm going to hold mine and we're going to go right to the questions that folks have posed. And then if folks have questions, they want to raise their hand after we get through these, feel free. So Colleen asks, for the merit review criteria, could you provide a high scoring example of investigator and environment?
Yeah, great question. So, what Reddit reviewers are looking for are investigators that have evidence of past success conducting studies of a similar size and scope. And if you aren't, if you don't have that, maybe you're a more junior investigator, then you would have a co-investigator on board with you who can provide some mentorship to you, who has had conducted, studies of that similar size and scope. We're looking for investigators that have expertise in the specific topic area, publications, and a lot of these, this is true in any proposal. All of these merit review criteria do kind of bleed into each other a little bit too. So we're also looking for investigators and a co-investigator team that is that is a broad team that includes stakeholders from clinical service environments, maybe funders even, that sort of thing that might also kind of bleed into that engagement side. For environment, we are looking for investigators from uh, 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 academic health centers and medical centers and universities themselves, like that kind of environment that has demonstrated success, again, with studies of similar size and scope.
Thank you. Steve asked if you could say a bit more about the purposes and advantages of the PCORI HSII systems approach. The criteria, expectations would be really helpful to know.
Yeah, that would be great. So that HSII system, remember the point of the HSII system is to help uh, uh, healthcare systems develop their own foundational ability to implement PCORI funded research findings. And the primary advantage of that, I guess there's two. I mean, the primary advantage of that is just helping provide you with some resources and time and some expertise around ways to do that. So health systems have used this to help improve, for instance, their data infrastructure, their ability to analyze across the data health system to find areas of weaknesses and strengths. They've used it to develop their own leadership and to help sort of create um, uh, uh, cross communication, meetings and other sort of foundational types of things that can help support implementation. So that's number one. Number two, one of the main advantages of being part of that is that it makes you available to apply for specific PCORI funding that's only released for HSII system participants. So, for instance, currently PCORI is funding a large number of healthcare systems to implement studies around electronic patient-reported outcomes. And so this is, money it's for people that are it's for cancer care delivery. And so applicants wouldn't be applicants wouldn't be allowed or eligible rather to apply for that funding unless they were an HSII system participant. The
Great.
criteria and expectations for the HSI mechanism. That's a great question. I don't know. I think I might have to sort of get back to you on, well, in terms of the criteria, I might have to get back to you on that. Or you see, it's difficult to find the application information. There should be a PFA, and in fact, I think it's live right now. And the criteria should be in that PFA. I don't really know off the top of my head, unfortunately.
Great.
Yeah.
And then a related question on that is, can only hospital systems be funded with that? Or could, for example, a large network of community health centers be appropriate?
I believe that large networks of community health centers are still eligible. you would want to double check with the PFA. I'm primary program officer in the CER program, so
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
read these PFAs and I do have some involvement in HSII. And I'm thinking of a couple of funded awardees that I think are just networks of community health centers, but I'm not positive about that.
We can check
So I'll
on that,
definitely
but that's
check the
helpful.
PFA. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Karen asks whether or not you could comment on if it's okay or not okay, discouraged to test financial incentives as an implementation strategy if the costs are manageable.
Yeah, Karen, that's a great question. And it's good to see your name. So this is okay. There can be the main sort of red flag that this one raises is the issue of uptake, right? So PCORI uh, one of the major areas of criteria, merit review criteria, as I mentioned earlier, and the criteria we look at is whether or not something is gonna have a chance for uptake in the real world. And financial incentives can oftentimes be viewed with a lot of skepticism about whether that's possible, just because there are a lot of barriers to that occurring in the real world. PCORI itself may also, depending on the study, may also express some reservations around financial incentives as an implementation strategy because they would be analogous to kind of patient care costs. Even though it's an implementation strategy and wouldn't be going to patients, it's not your kind of standard kind of research cost. It's going more towards the actual implementation of the implementation strategy. And we view those costs with great care. So it would really be, I think, only in a situation where you're really able to show that there's um, um, uh, really strong likelihood of it being of having strong uptake. And then the best case scenario and the best thing for you to do would be if you were interested in something like that is to have those financial incentives provided outside of PCORI funding, outside of PCORI's budget to you, and to have the health system or whatever provide that funding, just as the health system might provide the patient care cost for an intervention. That would be the most likelihood and probably the least likely to raise concerns.
Thank you. Shanti asked if you could review where we can find information about the PCORI engagement dissemination mechanism that was mentioned earlier. Was having trouble finding that.
Yeah, let's see. So on our funding opportunities page, one thing I really like about the funding opportunities page is that, we keep all of our funding opportunities up there even after they're closed. So you should be able to find it in there somewhere. Um, there are some, let's see, convening sports. So yeah, so I see some, okay, and then, okay. So let me share my screen. Let me make sure that. And this is actually just good, um, useful technique in general. All right, so here is uh, our funding opportunities page. One thing that's so you can refine your results. So this basically just provides all the funding opportunities. You can see when the letter of intent is due and when, if you're invited, when the full application is due. And so you can see which ones are closed pretty easily here. I'm on the second page right now. That's why everything looks closed. I'm way down there. So start on the first page. So you can see whether it's upcoming uh, or whether it's under review currently, which means it's basically closed to any new applications, or whether applications are completely closed. And then you can use this tool over here to refine your results. So you can look at your funding type. For instance, you could look at engagement and research, and dissemination and implementation, and search using that. And you can look through those, and I'm honestly, I'm really nervous about finding the right one that's the open and not the limited call right off the top of my head here. But you should be able to look through this list here and find them. They should be fairly obvious. And if you can't find it, you can always contact us, and we'll help you with that.
Perfect. So Katie asks, she wants to squash the rumor about PCORI funding or not funding single center type of studies, or do they typically need to be multi-center?
Yeah, so when you say single center, I guess I'd ask you this question. What's PCORI doesn't fund anymore single site studies. However, if you have a center that has multiple sites of care delivery, that would be permitted.
So they're not going to fund something in one practice, but they might fund something in a
Right.
network of practices.
That's
Yeah,
correct. That's
got
correct.
it.
Even if it's kind of a center that has multiple sites of care delivery, yeah.
Got it. That's great. And can you clarify the difference between an intervention being in widespread use versus usual care? Sounds like those are different in PCORI's mind.
Yeah, I mean they're highly aligned. I would say if it's usual care, it's probably widespread use. And then the usual care. So really, these are really two different things. So when we're talking about widespread use, we're talking about providing evidence for efficacy or widespread use. So it's kind of the level of evidence that we're expecting to justify whether something is being used or not. But when we're looking at usual care and talking about usual care, we're talking about really justifying why that usual care um, um, it's not justifying that usual care is widespread use or that has a level of efficacy. It's justifying why that usual care is a reasonable comparator in a comparative effectiveness research study. Like, how does it fit a true decisional dilemma? How does, if you're using usual care, how does it fit within the expectations of CER without being kind of just like regular effectiveness research? I feel like I didn't answer that super well, so please feel free to ask a follow-up question if you need to.
Well, and there is another question that's similar to that, and it's asking, can you clarify what you mean by a strong justification for using usual care as a comparator? Could you distinguish between a strong and a weak justification?
Yeah, that's a great
That might
question.
help.
Yeah. Um, I would say a strong justification for usual care would be situations where, so I should back up a little bit. Usual care has always been, I think, kind of an area of maybe some sensitivity at PCORI. And as we're getting in increasingly competitive environments, usual care studies tend to be kind of getting a little bit lower priority, which is why I'm suggesting that you really provide strong justification. I think I will tell you what strong justification would not be, and it would not be, is this intervention effective? You know, so it's kind of a weird rationale. It's like, well, because if we know the intervention's already effective and maybe already effective in the real world, then how is it really comparative effectiveness research? We really are looking for comparing two studies. There can be some situations, I think, maybe like with maybe rare diseases or maybe interventions that there really are no alternatives or that all of the alternatives are completely infeasible, or maybe it's questions that are maybe effectiveness is maybe one question, but maybe you're also really highly interested in things like implementability or usability as some of your comparative questions. Like perhaps in those situations, usual care might make more sense. Um, we do have an FAQ on usual care, and it may be worthwhile to spend some time looking at that.
That's great. And the very last question, do you fund any studies outside of the US? Do you do global?
W- We can. I think we have. They're low priority. Oh, and yeah, they're definitely low priority. And I would not recommend it.
Okay.
It'd be in this funding environment, I think it would be very, very challenging to get that funded.
Okay. Okay, that's great. This was so informative. Really, really appreciate your joining us today.
Yes.
Awesome. I suspect you may get some requests for consults. That, as Michael was saying, the PCORI system is you write in requests into their central system. You can have a consult. They schedule them, pretty quickly, and it's enormously helpful. I suggest going in with specific questions and look at all these hands clapping.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really, really, I found it extraordinarily helpful. Caitlin, our next session, do you want to say a little bit about that? I've lost the sauce here in my, all the questions in the chat.
Sure, yes. So it's going to be February 17th from 4 to 5 p.m., our normal third Tuesday of the month. And it's going to be possibilities and considerations for funding for implementation science at the William T. Grant Foundation by Kimberly Dumont, who is the senior vice president of the foundation. So we look forward to seeing you all then.
Excellent. So thank you very much, everybody. Michael, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. We'll see you next time. Bye.